But welcome everyone to our May 3rd Thursday. My name is Sarah Beach, and I am the program director here at the Writers League of Texas. You're in the right place. And before we get started, and I hand things over to my wonderful program manager, Laura, I'm going to make a few announcements about some exciting events we have coming up here at WLT. So this Saturday, we have a class on opening pages in fiction with the wonderful Antonio Ruiz Camacho. The first lines of a story are very important, as we all know, and this class will really help you identify what makes an opening compelling, what makes it propulsive, so you can hook your readers, or you can hook those agents if you're querying. And then next Wednesday, we have a class that's all about writing for younger audiences. Kidlit, of course, has its own set of craft considerations, and Meg Kuya is an award-winning Kidlit author who will walk you through those considerations, focusing on everything from the hook to voice to plot and everything in between, all with the specific lens of writing for kids. And then on Saturday, May 24th, next Saturday, we have a very exciting in-person event we're calling the Big Writer Meetup across Texas on the same day and at the same time. Our members are hosting meetups so that you can find and connect with other writers in your area. Probably the number one question we get here at WLT is, how do I find a writers group? How do I connect with other writers? And this is your chance to do just that. So if you live near one of these WLT logos, apologies if they're not completely accurate where they are, but if you live near one of these cities, please come out and meet some writers next Saturday. Mm-hmm. And then the following Saturday on May 31st, we'll have the fourth installment, the fourth of 10 installments for the Agent Symposium. And this presentation is with literary agent Marin Takikawa. It'll be all about finding the perfect comparison titles for your query letter. I personally think this is the hardest part of the query letter to get right. So I'm really personally very excited to hear Marin's advice on this. And then looking ahead to June, our next third Thursday will be on the topic of well-researched writing. I'm so excited about the authors we'll be talking to for this. Isa has written a beautiful historical fiction book we'll be discussing called The Unbecoming of Margaret Wolfe. Erin's written a post-apocalyptic novel called All the Water in the World, which features a colony of survivors living on the roof of the Museum of Natural History. It's a very beautiful book. And Alejandra has written a beautiful reported memoir called Rivermouth, which is all about her work as a translator and immigrant justice activist. It's a great panel, so I hope you'll join us again in June for that conversation. And then this July, we hope you'll dive into your writing with us at our summer writing retreat. We have 4 tracks with 4 brilliant instructors. You're guaranteed to leave this experience with your craft toolkit filled to the brim, and to have made a ton of progress on whatever it is you're working on. There'll be write-ins, craft talks, opportunities to meet with other writers. And the great thing about this retreat is that you don't have to pay for travel, you don't have to book lodging, you don't have to take time off work. It's a month of programming you can fit into your existing schedule, and you can do it from the comfort of your own home. So I hope you'll check that out. And then the Writers League of Texas is a member-based organization. With membership, you receive access to a bevy of resources and special events only available to our members. I encourage you to follow the link in the chat and to read all about those benefits. But also, being a member means that you help support the completely free programs we provide, such as our program we do in Title I schools called Project WISE, and our Texas Writes program in rural libraries across the state. And it also means you help fund our scholarship program, which allows access to our paid programs for writers who otherwise would not be able to afford it. So if you're not a member, I strongly encourage you to take the plunge. We'll make it worth your while. And if you're a member already and want to further support the work we do, we of course accept donations if you're in a position to do so. I know this probably isn't the first time you've heard this week or maybe even today, but it is a tough time for literary arts organizations. And so the fact that you've shown up this evening means everything to us. And whether you become a member or donate or not, we're incredibly grateful for your time. And I hope you'll continue to support the arts in whatever way suits you best. Which brings me to my next slide, and I promise I'm almost done. But we're so grateful to get to partner with one of the greatest independent bookstores in the world, Book People, here in Austin, Texas. It remains true that the best way to support authors is to buy their books and to do so at an independent bookstore. So at the links in the chat, you'll be able to order our panelists' books if you haven't done so already. And I think after hearing tonight's discussion, you'll definitely want to. And finally, brings me to the reason we're all here. I'm going to hand things over to our wonderful program director, Laura Arnold, who put this panel together and has been working very hard on this program. Laura, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome also to those of you who are joining us from our YouTube live stream. Thank you so much for joining us for our May 3rd Thursday discussion, Real World Stakes in Science Fiction and Fantasy. I'm Laura Arnold, the program manager here at the Writers League of Texas, and I am beyond honored to be able to put on events such as this and chat with such amazing writers. I am constantly inspired by this community. We're joined tonight by three wonderful writers who use the mediums of science fiction and/or fantasy to explore extremely resonant topics to our real-world selves. Our first panelist is Vida Cruz-Borja. Vida is actually joining us from the Philippines. Good morning, Vida. She is a fantasy and science fiction writer and editor. Her short fiction and essays have been published in Fantasy and Science Fiction, Fantasy, Strange Horizons, Podcastle, Expanded Horizons, and various anthologies. She won the 2022 Ignite Award for Best Creative Nonfiction for We Are the Mountain, a look at the inactive protagonist, and the Filipino National Book Award for Best Fiction in English for her illustrated short story collection, Song of the Mango and Other New Myths. Other award nominations, long listings, and recommendations include the Hugo Award, the British Science Fiction Award, and the James Tiptree Jr., now otherwise award. Thank you so much for being here, Vida.
Hey, good to be here.
Scott Guild is the author of the novel Plastic, a best book of the year in Scientific American, Our Culture, Locus, and many other venues. His work appears in Time, NPR, Literary Hub, Magnet, and others, where he's written about the carceral state, the climate crisis, and growing up bisexual in the 1990s. He received his MFA from the University of Texas at Austin, his PhD from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and is now a professor in literature and creative writing at Marian University in Indianapolis. A lifelong musician, Scott has also completed an album version of Plastic, out now through Sony Music and North Street Records. The album is a collaboration with musicians Cinder Talk and Stranger Cat, as well as the Grammy-winning producer Peter Kiedis. In his 20s, Scott was the lead guitarist and songwriter in New Collisions, a Boston art pop band that toured with the B-52s and opened for Blondie. Scott is an advocate for prison reform, serving for years as the assistant director of Penn City Writers, a creative writing program for students imprisoned in Texas, and teaching at Indiana Women's Prison. Thank you for being here, Scott. Ehigbor Okosun, or just Ehi, is the #1 Sunday Times bestselling author of Forged by Blood, the first in a Nigerian mythology epic fantasy duology. Raised across 4 continents, she now resides in the southern United States, where she writes speculative fiction, mystery thrillers, and contemporary novels for adult and YA audiences. She writes in hope of doing justice to the myths and traditions she grew up steeped in, and to honor her large, multiracial, and multi-ethnic family. She is a graduate of the University of Texas with degrees in Plan 2 honors, neurolinguistics, and English, as well as chemistry and pre-medical studies, and is a Cynthia Leitch Smith Mentorship Award finalist. When she's not reading, you can catch her bullet journaling, gaming, baking, singing, doing yoga, and spending time with her loved ones. Her second book, Exiled by Iron, came out on October 22nd, 2024. Congratulations, Ehi, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Before we jump into our discussion, I want to let our audience know that we'll be collecting your questions and we'll dedicate some time to answering them towards the end of the program. So please do submit any and all questions you have for our panelists for tonight's topic. To do so, you navigate to your Zoom toolbar, which is typically at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A option. You'll click that and submit your question there. All right, so I'm so excited to chat sci-fi fantasy tonight. I think the ways in which these genres reimagine the world allow for a unique freedom with which to address real-world topics, and I'm excited to dig into why and how. Let's start with talking about each of your books and the themes you explore within them. Vida, you wrote in your introduction to Song of the Mango and Other New Myths, the concept of having a just, equitable world, which is the theme of the stories, is nothing but a modern myth. Will you touch on how you explore this question through your short story collection? What other questions does your writing explore?
Okay. How do I? So to repeat that, that is how I explore it through my fiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm writing, I think I have the ending in mind already when I'm writing a story. And my task becomes, well, how do I justify that sort of ending to myself in a way that makes sense to me? And well, the last 10 years have been wild in terms of rethinking the way I think about and see the world, not just world politics, but also local, national politics on my end. We just had our elections last Monday. And once again, I feel like I'm feeling a shift in how I see things. Um, I I do not have the formula on hand, but I've managed to distill it in a formula. And it is, hold on, I'm sorry about this, but I did write the answer to this question in essay form. And I do have the formula right here. And my endings are determined by the intersection of what my characters desire, decide, and deserve. And then I try to strike the balance depending on what happened on the story there. And that's just how I see things. So there's a measure of intent, there's what they did with that intent, and then while I don't think anyone is a really good judge of deciding what somebody deserves, I get to decide it in a story because I'm God, basically. And so that's about it. And also, if you wanted to, so I'm gonna plug that. If you wanted to buy this, this is a limited edition essay that's released by Calc Press. And the essay is called Rendering Justice, and it is about how I think about endings.
Thank you, Vida. I loved what you said about being a writer is like playing God in your stories, and it's so nice to be able to imbue some of that justice to a world. Scott, plastic covers a lot of ground. What were the themes that were most important for you to address when writing your debut?
That's so interesting. So yeah, so your question is what were the themes that I was
Mm-hmm.
trying to address? I mean, I always tell this story that I don't show my work to a lot of people like while I'm working on it. So um to my wife, I we weren't quite married yet. I think I showed her the draft of the novel like 3 or 4 weeks before we were married, so the stakes were kind of high, like she hadn't really actually read that much of my work before because I was so secretive. But luckily it ended up getting published and everything worked out. But in any case, so I showed her the book and she gave it back to me and she's like, "Wow, you've written such an intense book about trauma." And I said, "It's about trauma?" I had no clue. So I think a lot of times, yeah, I try to lose myself in the characters and in the world building and everything. And then I sort of find out myself what the themes are as I'm going, if that makes any sense. So I think, yeah, plastic was a lot about trauma. I think it was a lot about our relationship to our own bodies and how we are getting farther and farther from nature and farther and farther from our own like connection to our physical selves and our connections to the past. So in a lot of ways, I guess it was really about alienation, but then and it's like satirical novel in some ways, but it's not meant to be like 100% satire. So I'd say by the end, hopefully the themes are coming across in a way that isn't just like the world's terrible, let's all give up, but a little bit more like there is hope and meaning to gather
Mhm.
us all together. But I did want to also give just a quick shout out to the Writers League of Texas because I was just looking it back, and when I was in Austin at school, almost exactly 10 years ago to the day, I was a volunteer at the Agents and Editors conference that you folks had. So it's like a full decade ago. I was graduating school and going in and like, fearfully approaching agents and everything. And the
Mhm.
Writers League was so helpful and everything. So little shout out, those of you here. Yeah, Writers League of Texas, just stick with them.
That was before my time, Scott. That's so amazing. That's a full circle moment.
Is it Noelle O'Donnell and let's see, Becca? Are they still involved in any way? Becca
Becca
Oliver?
Oliver.
Yeah.
Becca just left as the executive director this
Oh,
past January, and we have our new
yeah.
ED here with us, J. Evan Parks.
That's so cool. All right. Anyway, sorry. That's a little inside baseball.
Tell us about your duology. What are the themes you explore within it?
Oh God. Okay, can you hear me?
I can
I
hear you
think
just
the
fine.
green rectangle I think says that you can. Um, it's a bit tricky because every time people ask me about this, I think sometimes people ask me this question and they ask me because they think they know what the themes are, or they have read a little bit of it, or they saw the cover and they were like, oh, it must
Mhm.
be this, right? Um, and I think it's actually very difficult for me to just boil it down to a few things. Well, Vida, you pulled out an essay. I don't have quite an essay, but I have a note that I wrote to my readers. Um, I'll read this note to my readers, and maybe that will cue in what the novels are about, right? Um, Dear reader, myths take generations to be born but die in mere moments. Though myths have long coexisted with humanity, not every myth is given the same life. Some are judged and found wanting as power shifts in societies. Some are never given a chance to live. The ills of hatred, war, and prejudice rob us of the myths that keep us alive, acting as mirrors to help us find our best selves. So I wrote this book as an act of defiance. In my family, our myths are our inheritance. They are what form the backbone of our rich cultures, what have carried us through several wars fought to erase our very existence. I wrote this in hopes that one day you would pick it up and experience myth anew. You would walk with me and be a keeper of myth, a reminder to the world that stories grant us the power to imagine a multitude of thriving futures. Stories encourage us to be our best and live and love beyond what we think possible. Stories show us our voices matter and deserve to be heard. Stories heal, and we can too. So, thank you for giving this meditation on this mythology a chance. Thank you for journeying with me through Demi's eyes. Thank you for waiting on the other side. Let's do this. So that was a letter I got a chance to for like one of the editions I got a chance to write. They asked me, what would you want to tell a reader? What would you want to impart? Whenever I talk about this duology, I talk about it as what I call post-colonial fantasy. And I think a lot of us from the global majority, aka I mean I'm saying global majority now, right? Because I refuse to use deficit speech to really talk about, right? Those of us who are not very centered in the literary canon, but I really wanted to try to find a way to put it all together. And I think a lot of us write this kind of fantasy where we are processing our world and processing things that have happened in the past that are not so far back in the past that are still happening, right? That we're still living with the repercussions of, that we're still living with not even the echoes, like it's like the very presence is still like our ghosts are very much very present, right? So yeah. Those are really, it's really all of those things, and it's not just processing through those things, but it's also, I think one thing I wanted readers to take away, and I said that in this letter from this duology, is a kernel of hope, because I mean, I don't know if you've been watching Andor, right? But people like Andor is out here quoting a lot of like freedom leaders, and I'm like, I know where that came from and this, but it's okay. We're not going to spoil it. We're not going to spoil that we know where those references came from. Cite your sources, right? Um, but the idea that revolutions are built on hope. And I think that when people think about revolutions, they think about weapons and war and being in the streets, but even like the act of reconsideration, the act of forgiveness, the act of recalibration, right? Recalibrating your thinking about something that you've had before is an act of hope, right? It's always trying to figure out, like Vida said, like like, you're shifting things. What is the best way you can come back to something, right? And what comes out of that recalibration.
Thank you, Ehi. That was beautiful. I loved hearing the note to your readers. So well said. Thank you all for your wonderful descriptions about what you write and why. I'm actually going to now take a step back and set the stage for what a conversation about science fiction and fantasy entail. I wanted to dig into your relationship with genre definitions. How does your writing relate to the terms science fiction, fantasy, or even speculative fiction? I'll start with you, Scott.
Okay, I had on mute there. Yeah, that's a great question. And that's actually one I was thinking about a lot when I was preparing for this with like, because I think, for me, the genre definition, when you say, okay, I'm writing sci-fi or you're writing fantasy, it is kind of limiting in a way that seems to have more to do with like the marketplace and the way we use genre to delineate saying, oh, we're selling this as a sci-fi novel, we're selling this as a fantasy novel. When really, when you're doing the actual writing or when you're entering into imaginative worlds as a reader, you're just going into a speculative space of invention, and all the chopping it up into different genre categories always feels to me kind of sad. So in my book, there are sci-fi elements, and it's meant to be set, like around the 2080s or the 2090s, and there's been like a nuclear war in the 2040s. But it's also a world entirely of plastic figurines who eat nothing but boiled chicken. And their bodies are hollow, so they don't even have like a way to process and digest the boiled chicken, and that's like never addressed, on purpose, right? So there's this sense of which it's like it is using tropes of sci-fi in the idea of, okay, well, we're fast forwarding into the future and we're looking at a more fascistic, kind of less tolerant version of our own future. But at the same time, these speculative elements are warped and surreal too, and I think a lot of the genre stuff we do can blend together in really beautiful and interesting ways. And like just to go back to your point about theme earlier, I think genre creates theme in all sorts of interesting ways when we mash the genres together. So a lot of my, favorite writers like Ishiguro or Doris Lessing or things like that, like they'll be the most literary authors imaginable, but then they come in and like Doris Lessing has this wonderful book that nobody ever talks about called Shikasta. She actually wrote like a 5 book series of like sci-fi stuff. And yeah, it's just incredible what you can do when you take a really intense genre sensibility from like literary fiction, bring that into sci-fi, and then maybe also use magic realism too. And so yeah, I think for myself, like I grew up in a very like the modernists are everything kind of like hyper literary in environment with college, but not pretentious at all, of course. But I think when I realized that like wow, there's just all these different narrative options open, and you can just bring them all in and have fun with that. It's been really freeing for me. So I think genre can be limiting, but if you just look at it at like narrative patterns, and this is like your whole palette, like paint palette that you get to work with, it's a super exciting thing just to open that up. So I love how open literary fiction is to genre these days and how that's been developing. And I think I've been talking a long time, but I'm excited about that question. I like that a lot.
No worries, Scott. Ehi?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I was just like
Absolutely.
listening. Scott's voice is very sonorous, so I was just
Mhm.
like,
And he was saying very interesting and intelligent things as well. It was a question relating to how you relate to the terms science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction in your writing.
oh gosh, this is a little tough. And I feel like you wrote this question because you were like, haha, I'm gonna get her to admit it to everyone. It's okay, I'm just joking, right? Because I go around talking about speculative fiction and people are just like, what do you mean by speculative fiction? And I put it in my bio that I write speculative fiction and I write it across genres. Um, I also grew up with a very strong literary sort of an emphasis on the literary grades. I read, but I started reading Shakespeare very early on, right? There's, your 7-year-old companion, right? Yeah, Shakespeare, Austen, Dostoevsky, the like, right? Um, But the thing I find very interesting, especially when we talk about genre fiction and literary fiction, is a lot of times people really struggle to tease the two apart, right? If you look at it and function and what both are doing, I would actually argue that there's not that much of a difference. I guess this is my hot take, right? Um, but I think that people have an easy time saying, I think this is genre because this had this element, and I think this is literary because this feels a little more obtuse, right? Which I don't think is a very good demarcation, right? If you've ever read um, the Broken Earth series, like the fifth season, right, or even picked up, like you've got Nonna, Gideon, and Harrow, the ninth Tamsin Muir, like behind you. Like it's speculative fiction, right? But it's I would actually argue that some people from the literary world would consider it to be very like craft-wise, like on par with literary work, so on and so forth, right? So I think we must agree that there is some invisible demarcation between literary fiction and genre fiction. Um, and it's not always the same for everyone. And I think really what it boils down to is I think that there's a belief that those who will consider themselves literary writers are writing for the world, right? And those who consider themselves genre writers are a bit more indulgent in writing for themselves and their own little niche, right? Um, I would actually argue that that's actually entirely not true. And where your work ends up in classification really depends on the time you are writing the work. I mean, if you visit the time a lot of the literary greats are writing, what they were considered to be is not the way they're considered now, right? But yeah, I would argue it has to do with the time you are writing, and I would argue it has to do with also, what the world decides to do with your work after you've given it to the world. So
After
I
it's
think that's
already
all.
out there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
After exactly, right? Somebody tell Marlon James that he wrote a fantasy, right? But for me, I think of speculative fiction as the fiction of my heart. And I mean that to say I always love like playing with the idea of form and function. I always love just imagining things and not, but also not being held to a certain standard for how that work is going to come out. And I find speculative fiction the most freeing way for me to get to what I'm trying to say, right?
Mhm.
Um, Without having to be tied to the ideas of a certain period or a certain time. So for me, speculative fiction is like very much like the stories I had growing up, right? It's where the impossible touches the possible. It's where things that don't make like quite any sense like happen in your life every single day. And I think of how my father would tell me the fact that your body works is an impossibility, right? And I think about how those like that idea resonated through all the different stories they would tell us, right? And we were not quite sure what was true and what was fiction because that's how our lives like functioned.
I love
Um,
that. I
yeah,
love the phrase, the impossible touches the possible, as a way to think about science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction. I think that's so beautiful.
yeah.
Vida, um, how about you?
So the question is about my relation to the terms,
Science
right?
fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to try and not talk about the chip on my shoulder, but it's quite sizable. We'll make an attempt. But I come from a very young nation, and in terms as a movement, speculative fiction, which is how we umbrella term it over here, is a very young genre in a very young nation. We are in our golden age, actually. And then the movement only began like 20 years ago, though people had been publishing here and there science fiction, fantasy. And then I would also argue that our roots are in science fiction fantasy because our roots are in the epics of our different indigenous tribes. And those are very fantastical. And I've always loved those. I took up several local and foreign ones in college because I have a minor in English literature. And those have always, the huge, big spectacle of stories always captivated me. And I think that is where the direction I wanted to take my work. This is a problem. Here comes the chip on my shoulder. This is a problem in a country whose dominant mode for less than a century is realism. And not just any kind of realism, it's social realist realism. And a lot of us who are writing here, who are here writing speculative fiction, if we end up in, I would say, the wrong groups, because there are people who were trained without the lens of speculative fiction, without being able to talk about it academically, without being able to talk about craft in speculative fiction in a way that helps the story. And there's also questions of legitimacy, like what is the point of writing speculative fiction? We have so many problems as a nation. Literature should help forward nation building, and there's a place for that. But who's to say that speculative fiction cannot also build the nation? And that's what I believe in. But I also think that no writer should be boxed in to doing one thing if they don't want to. So I have some very political pieces, and I have pieces that are just fun for me. And I also, because social realist literature talks about how things are. Ideally, that's how it works. I, as someone who I think dissociated most of my childhood, as a lot of us who read SFF here know, want to talk about things as how they could be, which is probably also why I have a justice framework for my stories. Because I want to feel that sense of satisfaction that the universe is round. It goes around, it comes around. And sometimes when you're talking about how things are, that's absolutely not what happens.
That makes so much sense. Seeing how they could be is actually somewhat a really good segue into my next question. And so I'll keep it with you, Vida, as I wanted to dig into why you chose to write in genre as a vehicle to discuss the themes of your work and how removing your stories from the real world, in quotations, liberates you in your writing.
Right. So I think I am allergic to psychic boxes. Um, Luckily not real boxes, but psychic boxes, sure. I I have always bucked under being somebody's control, whether it's somebody I know or well, governmental control. I'm not a fan of that either. So um and to me, the best way to let loose is to let my imagination loose, even if nobody ever hears the kind of discussion I'm having in my head. I'm free, at least. And so I'm freest when I'm inventing things, when I'm making, I don't want to say I'm making a box for myself, but I'm setting parameters for myself. And sometimes those parameters have magic. Sometimes they have technology that is beyond our wildest dreams. But my rule for myself is always I have to anchor this in what is real, which may sound like it's contradicting what I said in the last couple of minutes, but it's not. It's to sell something, in my view, you've got to anchor it in the thing that is realist to you. For me, the realist thing to me is my own emotions. So I'm always trying to hit some kind of emotional punching bag when I'm writing. I hope that I manage to hit those bags when I'm done with the story. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
I think that it was a good answer. I think that it made sense. Um, how about you, Ehi? How does removing your stories from the real world liberate you in your writing?
So this is kind of funny. because I also do write what I call speculative contemporary, and
Mhm.
people would say that's very much the real world, right? But then obviously there are some things that are happening that don't feel like the real world, or if they started happening, I would hope you would call somebody for help, or you'd be like, oh God, I don't know, something's going on. It's a bit freaky. Um, I think I think that writing is difficult. And it's difficult because you're putting not just your heart on the page, you're giving not just your entrails, right? But you are writing the characters as they are and seeing them as they are in the reality that the way you're communing with the page, you're creating a reality, right? And when people read, they bring their own reality to the page, right? And the act of reading is an act of communion as well, right? Where people are going to bring their own baggage, right, to what is on the page, and they're going to decide what they want to take in and what they want to discard, and maybe they'll decide to discard everything. Who knows? But I think for me, it's if I have a real world framework and I'm telling you things that have happened, and you could take those things, or you could say, I identify with this, but not this, right? But I feel like it's easiest to always like destabilize, dissenter, and invite people into my world by just completely like just knocking them off their behinds, just saying like, hey, we're going, right? And I feel that speculative fiction like is for me the quickest vehicle to do that. And I think it is the quickest vehicle to that for me because it is so reflective of what I felt like my life has been a lot of times, where I think we're all humans, we're born into this world, right? And we have ideals for what life should be. And so often, so many of us don't have those ideals. Or even if we have the ideals, our lives are not, it's not easy to put those ideals into our lives, if that makes sense, right? And I feel like speculative fiction is like the quickest, the best way to just encapsulate that. But then also, like Vida and Scott said earlier, to imagine like, okay, if this could turn on a dime, like if I entered this book and all this stuff happened and I was like, whoa, and I'm disentered as a reader, and but now I can imagine someone else's reality, right? Now I'm not stuck behind no, but I thought that people in the Philippines only spoke. Do you know what I mean? I'm leaving my baggage behind because I'm like, oh, I'm encountering more things I didn't know were possible, right? It also allows me, if the text moves on and the text shows what could be a possibility, like a future, it allows me to accept that future and to think about it and to keep moving, thinking about it. So,
Thank you, Ehi. Scott, the same question to you. How does removing your stories from the real world liberate you in your writing? All of the people in your world are quite literally plastic, as you said before. So,
Yeah. Gosh, those were so many great answers too. I feel like I had something I wanted to say, and then there were so many brilliant bits and pieces that I want to respond to. So this may be a little ADHD, like everything
no
I do.
worries.
Yeah, so I feel like one of the best genre terms that I heard that I really latched onto is something called have any of you heard of something called speculative realism? Has that crossed anyone's desks where and I really like that because it was the idea that like you're going to do speculative fiction, you're going to invent things that are not, what you look out your window necessarily and see factually every day, but you're going into those speculative places because you're trying to get at things that are very real in the world. So like Toni Morrison's Beloved or something would be, a very powerful speculative fiction, right? Because it's using the genres of horror and it's using the genres of, literary fiction, and it's also using like tons of gothic stuff, all trying to get at like the realities of the nightmares of American history in various ways and so much. So it's speculative fiction, but it's not like dissociative, like we're just going into like a fantastical space for the fun of it. We're going into a very unfun space, actually. But and I really think like that. So that term for me really kind of united everyone from like Kafka to Toni Morrison to like Ursula K. Le Guin to all these people where it's like they are such serious writers and they really are writing about in many ways the dynamics we're dealing about in contemporary life, but they're finding ways to tell stories that cut through and are the most meaningful for them. So I felt like that was kind of a way of me thinking about like the fiction I'm most excited about, which is just you just get the sense that the writer is pushing as hard as they humanly can to get at the things that matter most to them or the emotions that matter most to them. And like I love like Marilyn Robinson is one of my favorite writers too, where like that is not sci-fi writing, that's not speculative fiction. That's like people in the 1950s in one small town in Iowa, like having a very real time of it with each with each other. And like I adore that. If she were to alter that world slightly, where there was like a little less gravity and everyone like floated around, like maybe I'd like the world better. You know what I'm saying? Like you could mingle that in there if there was like a good thematic purpose for it. So yeah, so I think that for me is where my head is at now, which is just like maybe I will write more realist fiction, like just straight realist fiction in the future, but it's always like you have to have that feeling of like an intense impulse behind it. And I will say like the my next novel I'm working on now is even weirder than where everyone's plastic figurine. So obviously like whatever space I'm in where I'm doing that kind of invention hasn't gone away. But yeah, that was really where I was coming from. I think when I was writing plastic, maybe I didn't articulate it that way to myself, but seeing a world where we're actively destroying our planet and we've completely enclosed ourselves in our own cultures and technologies to the point where we're kind of losing sight of like the global ecosystem we're a part of in so many different ways. And so then all the characters in the book end up being plastic figurines with hollow bodies. That's definitely not, I mean, I try to get a lot of humor out of that, but also I think that's definitely me trying to be like, okay, I want to write in as realistic a way as possible, but how do I get at what it really feels like to be in a world that's destroying itself and so alienated from its own, organic whatever. And I will say, like, as a suburbs kid growing up, like I am the most alienated from nature person. It's not like I'm like going on the Appalachian Trail and hiking and criticizing everyone. I'm very much like the most plastic of us all. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question though, but I was so many cool things were said. I feel
Yeah.
like,
You all had excellent answers. Um, I want to get a little technical as we are on a panel for writers. In science fiction and fantasy, you have to introduce your readers to different rules of reality and expectations of language. Um, how do you do that within your work? Scott, I found the dialogue in Plastic really striking, so I am going to stick with you as
striking
we.
good or striking bad.
Good, striking good.
Because with the dialogue in my book, for those of you, yeah, for anyway, for people who aren't familiar with it, it's this kind of like boiled down, like late stage capitalism language where like most of the articles are missing. So it's like, like I go store now, like that. It's like it's supposed to feel like very like clipped, like a text speak. Yeah. So trying to get that to flow smoothly where you could understand the meaning of what the characters were saying, even though it was like shrunk down so much, that was definitely something you felt like you had to you know, ease the reader into. And then there's other sections where the characters talk differently. So like I didn't want to have so much of it that you would like overwhelm the reader. Yeah. But no, I kind of learned to write science fiction through writing that book. So it was really interesting working through the years on it and being like, okay, like everything in this world is not supposed to be quite our world. So like I'm not calling it climate change, I'm calling it the heat leap. And I'm not, and like when people in this world when they get hurt, they use something called wound glue because their skin cracks apart and they have to like paste it together. So there's all I think one of the best things about speculative world building is you can start with like something very large and then trace it to all the smaller iterations of how it appears, and those like smaller details are often the most fun. But yeah, I feel like if you start out the book and you're just loading up the reader with like world building stuff, you are gonna lose them, and you have to kind of be aware. Like, well, it's almost like taking someone on a tour of your house and then like showing them where there's a hole in the floor, because we all have large holes in the floor.
I want to push in on that a little bit.
Oh, do you?
Did did you find drawing on like wound glue and the heat um, jump did drawing parallels to our world because those do evoke
Oh
the
yeah,
the
yeah.
same
Mhm.
phenomenon in our world. Did that um, ended up help you with your world building, or did it become more difficult to like just slightly remove it?
No, I mean it was always a lot of fun because it was like taking what we have right now and just like twisting everything slightly in a different direction. So it would kind of like let you
Hmm.
look at different angles of it. And just like I mean, maybe I have a very gallows sense of humor, but there's something about the way that we've made everything a commodity and boiled it down that it's just so pleasurable to mock it. And you can't do it too
Pull
much. You're
that
gonna
out.
like George Saunders, like mid-career George Saunders. You have to be careful.
Hmm.
But it's so yeah, that is the thing, is like our world now. I mean, if you think about like Doge and everything they're doing, like it's evil and insidious, and it's also so stupid to a point where there's a lot of laughter in the midst of the crying,
Hmm.
Anyway, yeah.
How about you, Vida? How do you introduce your readers to different rules of reality and expectations of language in your writing?
Okay, so I was looking through my book and looking at my first sentences because my principle about this is that from the very first sentence, very first page, I've got to be setting the setting already. So my approach means that I am thinking very deeply about each word and their order in the sentence. And I'm also thinking about exactly what is this sentence conveying about the time and the place and the character we have. Well, there's a principle in journalism with, and I used to be a journalist, you got to have the who, what, when, where, why set in your first sentence. And then in many of my stories, I try to follow this principle. So like in one of in the title story of my collection, we have Song of the Mango. The first sentence is sit beneath the shade, child, and I will tell you the tale of how the mango came to be. So you're already imagining maybe an older person telling a younger person a tale from long ago. In another story, I've got the Museum of Incomplete Statues. There's a girl in a leather jacket meandering down the winding ramp of the Museum of Incomplete Statues. And I mean, I don't know if that's conveying surrealism, but we don't have a Museum of Incomplete Statues. But I've already got your tone down. I'm already setting the tone for what the story is going to be. And it's also somewhat set in the modern day as well. And then, wait, I have another one. Well, in the one sci-fi story I've got in this book called The Rhyme Folk, the first sentence is, when I got home from my shift at Upper Manila City Tech Support one afternoon, Roland was sitting on the computer chair and staring at his upturned palms, stippled with the light shapes of the planets of the purple and cerulean solar system, scarlet, orange, saffron, and indigo, from the stained glass solar window. And I'm not sure what that painted in your head, but this story is solar punk. So, like, very, I'm intentionally trying to set the rules from the first sentence. Of course, like that, I mean, you don't always do that. Sometimes you need a whole paragraph to set the thing, but like generally I try to do who, what, when, where, why from the get-go.
Ehi, how about you? How do you introduce readers to different rules of reality and expectations of language in your world?
So here's where I reveal that I'm a chaos demon. Not really. Oh yeah. Um, okay. So reading is an act of communion, so is writing, right? And we writers are like, we built a hotel, right? And you, the reader, come to the hotel with your baggage and you put your baggage down and you're like, oh my God, I love these towels. Oh no, my bed is a little bit too hard, right? And that's how I envision it when I think about readers coming to the work. But the thing is, as an architect, as a hotel builder, you can only build your hotel. The hotels you build, the books will be different, right? But readers, whether or not they decide to come to that hotel with you, whether they decide to put their things down, all their reactions will be different, right? So the thing is, I think in today's world, we have a lot of writers who are sort of, because of technology, there's been an erosion of the space between writers and like storytellers and their audience. everybody, audience members, I mean, you're in a literature class and people are asking you like, what do you think this author meant? And they're like, well, I found this about their personal lives, so I think this is what this means. And I'm like, it actually really bothers me, and it bothers me a lot because it used to be that we had stories, we had fiction, nonfiction, and we would spend some time really delving into the themes, arguing about it. And it wasn't about who's right or who's wrong. It was very clear that everybody has their different sort of subjective feelings about things, right? But the point was in teasing out what those feelings exactly are. The point was in communing and understanding what is my link, what is the thread, what is this thing that keeps this work in my mind? Why can I quote this entire Shakespeare play? Why do I care? Right? That was always the point, is why do I care? Because why you care is going to be different from why someone else cares. That's just how it is. And so the thing for me, knowing this, is when I write, you know how people ask you, like, do you envision your audience? Like, who's this? You know what I mean? I these days, before I used to answer that question and say, oh, I envision like this, like I would say kind of like a vague term, somebody who needs blank, right? But now I don't even do that anymore. I just say like when I'm writing, I'm just writing. I'm just writing and I'm trying to tell the truth. And I'm trying to tell the truth means I'm trying to get the characters right as they are and let them be who they are, let them live on the page, and hope that that will touch a reader. Because the moment I start envisioning somebody specific, I'm limiting myself to what that specific person will react to or not react to. And for this reason, when I'm revealing things in a story, I think of it as sort of a puzzle that you have to put together. You have to pay attention to get all the pieces of the puzzle, right? But I like to do things like add a timer, and I'm like, look, there's, a big barrel of water over your head that's going to explode. So pay attention, right? And for that, it means, like, I think of it as, how children come into a space. Like, honestly, children come into the world and they know very little about the world, and they figure things out by pattern recognition, but they also figure things out by testing. But they have this sort of like childlike, like, readiness to try, willingness to try. So what I try to do for my readers is get at their willingness to try immediately by not making it easy and telling them, here's exactly what you'll need to know. Here's your manual to my world. But also not being like, here's a punch to the face, right? And here's another one. I might start the book with a punch to the face, right? But I want it to be like a tether. This is what you can expect. So if another one comes, you know to duck or you know to try to punch back, right? So I think of it as I reveal things. I think of it sort of actually as I'm writing as like yarn that I'm unspooling. I reveal things when they need to be revealed. Sometimes there'll be a lot of things, sometimes there'll be just a few things, but it's a dance of trying to keep that attention, trying to keep readers coming back, trying to engage them so that they can actually read and not be scouring Instagram like, do you think she meant this when she said milk?
That makes sense. And it's actually also an interesting lead-in to my next question as well. So I'll stick with you and we can continue onward from there, which is you each draw on your own life experiences and identities in your work. And how does drawing from that personal experience and background enrich your writing, especially in the mediums of science fiction and fantasy?
Oh gosh. Any writer who says that they're not drawing on their personal experience when they write is a liar.
They're lying.
Yeah, they're lying. Yeah. And I say this even about writers who were famously really good at externalizing and telling other stories, right? We have lenses that we view the world through, and our experiences will give us a certain kind of perspective on something, right? That being said, when we write, and I don't know if this is true for you, Vida and Scott, but when we write, we're also trying to get at the characters, because I think also there are a lot of assumptions that like you can find out my entire personal life by like reading my books, and I'm like, nope, you can't. Thanks, Laura. Thanks. Right? But there are some things that are me that will be in the story, right? But I think at the heart of it, the thing I want to impart to every single book is, is a bit of hope. I think that that's what I really like leave in every single book is no matter who the characters are, what they do, whether or not I agree with their actions, right? I put them as they are on the page. And what I want from people to take away with every single book is a bit of hope. And I think about Scott mentioned Toni Morrison's like Beloved, right? And there's that famous passage at the end where she says, "It is not a thing to pass on. It is not a thing to pass on." And like pass can really be read three different ways, right? And it's so heartbreaking to think about how do you impart a legacy of pain, but also of joy, but also of like, complexity and seeking, but also how do you let people know you have to pay attention. You have to actually do this thing. You have to connect, right? And so that's how my personal, like me, that's how I connect to my work is I write the best story. I always try to write the best story I can at the craft level I can for or whatever the book requires, so I can impart that little piece of me, which is like this is a bit of hope that you will see what you need to find in this book. And so that's really how my personhood affects the work on that macro level. And on the micro level, I would say things like there will always be languages in my book. There will always be considerations of like, okay, well, who's at the top, who's at the bottom, who's sideways, like what are the power matrices? Because that's how I've had to think about living my life.
Thank you. Scott, how about you? How does your personhood affect your work, especially in speculative writing?
Gosh, I'm thinking so much about Toni Morrison right now. I will get back to myself. I feel like
Just
I'm
it's
the
an
least interesting part of this question. Well, I just with what other people are saying, I was remembering. So I taught Beloved in a class last semester, and it was one of my favorite moments of the class was there was all these different groups in the class, and each one of them got like a different sort of theoretical framework to bring to Beloved. So some people were bringing, well, Toni Morrison was a Catholic or was raised Catholic, so some people were giving a Catholic reading. Some people were doing kind of like a post-colonial reading, a postmodern reading. I think there was like a psychological reading. And it was so fascinating to see this book, which had been such like a personal passion project for Toni Morrison. You could put all these different frameworks on it and be teasing. I mean, so, it was like in one class period, and it's everything from talking about like Medea, because, there's like a lot of Medea, inspiration in Beloved to, to Freud and Freudian theory, Freudian theories and things like that. So I think there's an extent to which like we have our intentions for what we're trying to create from the book, and that's coming from this wellspring of pain and interest. But then it's also you're putting a book out into a world which is so complex and manifold, and it's so interesting to see how different meanings can get mapped onto it. So I think like increasingly that's a challenge I have for myself, which is like yeah, I don't think I'd be a writer if I wasn't like the biggest like dramatic person around. Like in my, I'm just like so worked up all the time. I have very strong emotions, but I try to put that into the page and the things I'm writing. And so the books tend to be very particularly about what I'm trying to write about. But then it's exciting, this thought of like, if you make parts of it ambiguous, if you don't map it too closely onto your own life, then you can sort of reference towards myth and reference towards history and all these different spaces. So yeah, so I think in my own life, I feel like yeah, I am stuck with a set of themes and a set of types of characters, or even like an approach to language, just because like I am the person I am. And stuck isn't the right word because I love writing and it's my favorite thing to do. But I feel like as the years go on, I know sort of like the terrain I'm in. But then what's exciting is like all the different ways that the outside world can come in and different layers of meaning can get connected to that. I hope that isn't all too abstract, but
That makes sense. Vida, how does your life experience, personhood, and identities affect your work, especially through the lens of speculative fiction?
Okay. So I'm gonna try and connect this to like the name of our panel, real world stakes. Um, I feel like to be a Filipino, there's always some one or two things at stake, the personal and the bigger picture. And just to paint you a picture, we have hundreds of languages that are still in use. We're an archipelago. We have a distribution problem, not just the books, but everything. And then we're also run by oligarchs, have been run by oligarchs for hundreds of years, I would say. And if you're just an ordinary person in this kind of setting, where you also have other countries encroaching on your nationhood and your independence, you tend to ask yourself, what is it that one small person can do? And honestly, the answer is realistically probably not a lot, not beyond your sphere of influence. And sometimes you're just sitting there and watching your history march by you and feeling like, even if I voted like this, I affected nothing. So this is the kind of thing that I'm always holding in mind, probably not even consciously, when I'm writing. And when I think about how uh, what is it that we can actually affect, there's a place for for a story where the hero comes in and saves the day. There definitely is. But for me, not really living in that kind of world. That's if I tried to write that, that wouldn't feel true. So I'm mainly writing about ordinary people who are doing the best they can with the tools they have. And because that is also what I am. And that's how that affects my writing.
That was beautiful. Thank you. I have one last question, and then I'm going to go into audience questions. So what I'm going to pose to each of you is, as genre fiction writers, how do you see science fiction and fantasy evolving with our changing world? And how and why should we continue to tell stories using these forms? Ehi?
Oh, wow. Not you throwing me a loaded question. Ooh.
A really easy one. I'm so
Oh
glad you're
my gosh.
so
Yeah, I
simple.
am
Yeah, just define the
I'm
whole genre. Yeah.
I'm not going to say that I think when we talk about evolutions in the way genre fiction, especially science fiction, fantasy, and whether it's being perceived and what is, there's no way to talk about what that without talking about what is popular, right? And what is taking the day or taking the energy right now, right? Um, but one thing I will say, I mean, I'm sure I could sit here and talk about romantasy and why it's not new and cozy fantasy and why I find that to be very hyperbolic. But I mean, there's so many things I could say, right? But what I will say is I believe that fantasy as it was conceived of or conceptualized, thousands and thousands of years ago, and not in Europe. Please stop telling that lie, right? Um, it was a way for human beings to try to not just explain their world, because I feel like that's a very cheap way to say it, but I think it was a way for them to reach beyond themselves. It was a way for them to hold the complex in their bodies and to accept themselves as complex and to also extend that sort of grace to other people and use that as a framework for community building, right? Um, and you know, science fiction I consider to be entirely the same on that, it because really science fiction is fantasy for some, right? Even if it's riffing or responding to or imagining things from a technological standpoint, right? There's a good novella by Adrian Tchaikovsky called Elder Race, which is interesting in that it talks about, for one set of people, it's fantastical. They're wizards. And the wizard in question is having his chapter is always just like, I'm working with the droid, or man, the mining, I have to check my interface. I'm getting all these error messages from my computer. And it's so interesting the way it all plays out for people, right? But I will say that these things are going to continue to evolve and change. The genres, as we understand them, are going to continue, like every genre, to evolve and change. And what's popular is going to somewhat dictate that. But at the end of the day, I will say my hope for the genre is that it continues to be a community building thing. It continues to be something that, again, forces people to learn how to extend grace and empathize with others, because it really does force you to put yourself, like, to be out of body, to put yourself in other people's shoes and situations, and to not do the thing and where you go, I would never do. Yes, sir, you absolutely would. So please, right? Yeah, that's really like my hope for the genre. And I'm still waiting for someone to again convince me of a cozy fantasy that, would no, honestly, okay, y'all, listen, the day in the life of a hobbit, we care about that because we know what a hobbit is and we know what is a stake for the hobbit, right? Without that, would we actually care about a day in the life of a hobbit?
Thank you, Ehi. I enjoyed that. Scott, as a genre fiction writer, how do you see science fiction and fantasy evolving with our changing world, and how and why should we continue telling stories using this form?
I mean, I think from, again, I'm probably not like the world's most like finger on the pulse of like every book that's coming out all the time, but I do, at least for myself as a reader, feel like it's a very exciting time for speculative fiction and science fiction, and in a lot of ways just because of similar things to what I was saying before about how some of these genre walls are crumbling a little bit. So you have people who, primarily write sci-fi, winning the Nobel Prize and things like that, where there's not a sense of people like looking down their nose at science fiction anymore. And I think part of it is I think a lot of us feel like we are living in a sci-fi world at the moment. Everything changed so much over the last 25 to 30 years. I think when people write speculative fiction or science fiction, it doesn't feel like it might have felt like if you were reading H.G. Wells in like the 1920s or something, like, whoa, what is he going to come up with next? Like we're kind of living in a world where a bunch of, probably bad intentioned people have completely morphed our reality through mass technology, right? So I had a chance to do one of the like a literature roundup thing on climate fiction for Electric Lit when my book was coming out. And it was really interesting to see. I think it was like 8 or 9 titles, and they were all published in the last about 18 months, and they were all about just the world 10 to 15 years from now. And I was like, that is so exciting that there's actually a vibrant voice of novels coming out from all these different perspectives, from very, very literary to like very, very like kind of like hard genre, where you'd think about like just like, showing up at cons or something like that, but all kind of grappling with like, what is it going to mean to watch the society like tip over that bump where the climate crisis is something that we can't ignore on a daily basis. So I think I'm just looking forward to that going on, or maybe even gaining steam more, where we can sort of like we can see where their future is going, and we can almost write realist fiction set 20 to 30 years from now, or stuff that has the same kind of like serious and focus as that, because yeah, we're dealing with these things together. So I think it has immense potential to, kind of deepen our discourse on things. And if you think about like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, like that book that came out, like I do think there may be a moment where a novel gets huge because it does wake everybody up to some of these climate issues. So I know in some ways we're all a little like off to center, like watching Marvel movies as writers, but I do think there's still a capacity for books to really like speak to the culture in a larger way, just through the power of imagining what our future might be and the choices we're going to have to make. So.
Thank you, Scott. And then Vida, I'm going to pose the same question to you. As genre fiction writers, how do you see science fiction and fantasy evolving with our changing world? How and why should we continue to tell stories using these forms?
So, I'm gonna build on something that Ehi said. Um, is community building. So, a lot of us started reading science fiction and fantasy when we were little. A lot of us also tend to come from very traumatic childhoods. If you were not allowed to be a child, science fiction and fantasy allowed you to. So it is always going to be one's mental playground. And if you went out and tried to find community who like to read the same things, chances are they're just like you. They have, in gaming terms, they have different skins, but they're just like you. So I think the future of the genre is its one constant, which is that it is allowing you to be a child and allowing you to find other children.
Thank you, Vida. That was beautiful. We're going to transition to audience questions now. Please feel free to jump on as you feel appropriate. I'm not going to direct these towards any of you. Um, and after a couple of questions, we're going to wrap up. The first question from Lucy Simpson is, where would magical realism fit into speculative fiction?
I'll
Oh
jump in.
man.
I just think I don't. I mean, I have a very short answer, which is I don't know that they're different. I mean, I think I would think of them very similarly. Would anyone disagree with me though? Am I being too reductive in my like genre classifications there?
No, I don't think you're being reductive. I mean, I think of it as like, people joke about the not your grandmother's speculative fiction or whatever, or your grand. No, but I think there is a cultural aspect, at least in the West, right? The West defines magical realism as belonging to a specific place, right? Although I would
Hmm.
say that there are a lot of cultures who the writings are like magical realism, they're speculative realism, right? They are doing things, they are telling stories, but it's not, again, I would cling to speculative realism rather than saying fantasy, right? Because for people, those things are very real, right? And I think it's a matter of being respectful, acknowledging that the uncanny lives in the everyday for so many people.
Hmm. Hmm.
Can't
Um,
say it better than she did.
We have a question from Catherine Godwin that says, I am a woman in the military. Many of my experience I have had in the military have shaped the way I see the world. I want my novel to explore those themes and experiences that I have lived, but am struggling with narrowing my focus. What advice would you give to someone who is struggling to pick the direction for their story?
There's a lot of there's honestly thousands and thousands of pieces of advice that we could give you, and I don't think we would have the same piece of advice. But on my end, I have found that when I am stuck on plot, or if I don't want this to be a plot heavy story, the thing that guides me most is the emotional journey of the characters. So that in itself is a narrative structure. So how do you get from, let's say, character A starts out angry and you want them to end up as happy? Like that's just an example. So how do they go from this emotion to that emotion? This one way to unstick.
Yeah, I would say, what are you most afraid of? And how can you run towards the thing you are most afraid of? Because I think honestly, a lot of times when we're writing, we tend to hold ourselves back, we tend to self-edit, we tend to be afraid. And it could be, how are people going to receive this? Or am I getting it just right the way the character needs me to? And every single time I'm afraid of something, I'm like, let's just do it. Right. Or I mean, sometimes I tell myself, like, you know what, let's just kill all the characters. And that gets me going. Right. Because I'm just like, if everybody's dead, there's no story. Right. And then I'll start that's sort of like the mental trigger I need to like free myself to stop being like worried or to like break out of like the like the holes I have myself in.
And I really agree with what both of them said, where, yeah, I think that rooting yourself in character can often be the solution because it's almost like a different part of your brain, I think, that gets tapped. Like when you're trying to do abstract story design, things can make sense. But then at the end of the day, when you're writing a book, it's just you and your characters and scene after scene, summary after summary. So you really have to be able to have something like driving the characters forward. So yeah, like being rooted in the emotions of the characters, and nothing's better than fear. Oh my gosh, fear is the best. Like if you can really tap into your own fears and put one of your big fears in a character's life, then a lot of times the scenes just write themselves because you're just like, gushing out of that place. So it's almost like you're looking for like spigots to turn on in yourself that then flow through your characters, if that's not too weird of a way of saying it. But yeah, I find that when I've been stuck in a project, when I look back, it's always because I hadn't gone deep enough into really what my characters were facing and then how to like let that push the story forward or something like that. Because a lot of narrative design is just like putting your character in a situation that means an incredible amount to them and stirs strong emotion to them, and then just watching what they do as they face that step after step. So I hope that's helpful a little bit.
Thank you all. And then one last question from an anonymous asker. Are there any topics that you're interested in exploring and writing about in the future?
Does anyone else want to start or?
Oh, so many. Gosh, I'm just thinking about what I'm writing right now. Oh, so many things. Comas. Gosh, comas.
God. I'm working on like 4 different books right now, all in different
What?
stages. Yeah. My friends tend to be like, what's wrong with Ehi? Like, AKA, what is she working on now? Avita's laughing. But
Can you
yeah,
split
like,
it up like by the day? Like day one, book one, day two, book.
no, I tend to be all in on a project. So I'll like, all in on a project and then but I can also just like take a break and be like, I'm gonna go edit this for a few hours. And then sometimes I'll like wake up from sleep and be like, actually, instead of working on this project, I'm going to write like 10,000 words on this other project, and then I'll go back to the original, so it works like that for me.
Very lovingly, do you still sleep?
Do I you know, I do sleep these days. I do. I have to. Otherwise, I'm not functional. But I will say that the hours of 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. are my friend.
That's
They're my
awesome.
friend.
My wife and I are having our first kid in like 2 weeks, so
Huh.
sleep that too.
Oh gosh,
You should
well,
sleep some more
yeah, you
then.
should
I,
sleep.
I feel like I'm very interested in writing about everything to
Congrats.
do with. Thank you. Oh my gosh, yeah, we're
Yeah.
great. But I feel like yeah, it's
Congrats.
like opening up a whole world of writing because I'm about to get like broken into a million little,
Oh
very
yeah.
happy pieces, you know.
A
You
lot
know,
more to write about.
somehow I feel like comas have some sort of connection to this.
Oh
Right,
yes.
right.
No. I mean, the first like my partner is just like survive the first 6 weeks and you can do anything.
How to
Like,
get through that initial, yeah, yeah. But I do think my night owl tendencies are for the first time going to serve me a little bit because if I don't, I'm often up so late anyway. I'm just going to be sitting there like good baby, like you know. Yeah.
Mm. So on my end, I have a story due in August for an anthology, and I have, I feel like I am barely starting on this thing because the research is so heavy. And I don't know why I did this to myself, but the story is about historical linguistics and decipherment. So I'm researching heavily on how does one even crack a language that is extinct. And it's really, really meaty stuff. And my husband is probably no, actually no, he's interested too. He's gonna hear me listen to a bunch of playlists about how someone did this or that. It's fascinating.
We'll look forward to it. I hope to see it out in the world. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Vida and Scott and Ehi, for joining us tonight. I hope everybody in the chat will support these wonderful writers by buying their books. So please check them out in the chat box. Thank you so much for those who joined us here on Zoom and for those who are watching on YouTube now and in the future. Happy writing, everyone. Good night.
Much everybody for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank
thank
you.
you.